I'm so glad to welcome again to Grace Dr. Fred Luskin, who is a Stanford University professor and the leader of the forgiveness project there. And it has just been a wonderful companion to us before the pandemic, but especially this year, joining us monthly to lead us in meditation and frequently for sermons that have brought a lot of richness, I know, to my life about resilience, about the practices that help us do that. So thanks again for being here, Fred, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. You know, it's so funny using the word like being here. I'm sitting in my car having dropped off my son at SFO, and you're in an empty church, and you know, it's an interesting change of what the word here means. But be that as it may, I'm glad to be here. And in fact, I almost always appreciate being asked to talk for Grace Church. You know, what I was going to talk about today was, it was a reminder to me, having read two pieces of data about like the decrease in church affiliation and church attendance over the last 20 years. I mean, for me, it is, I don't even, it's surprising, maybe not the right word, but certainly unexpected. I mean, they showed that the number of people who like consider themselves Christians, I mean, affiliated with the church, has gone from about 70% of the population 20 years ago to about 47% now. And that's the biggest like 20-year change or any year change that they've seen. The second is the number of people who like go to any kind of organized religious service, like in person, but I guess in computer now would qualify too, is about 25% of the population. It's about 1 in 4 people go regularly to church. And what's so interesting about that is they define regularly as 3 attendances out of 8 weeks, that a little less than half is considered regular attendance. And I remember reading about this when I began my postdoc at Stanford's medical school, because I'm very interested in the effect of spiritual and religious, both practices and attendance and beliefs on people's health. Like that's a deep, both personal interest and scientific interest. And with the dramatic change in that, and it had started, you know, even before this 20 years, I did a lot of searching on, well, what are the benefits of church attendance, religious affiliation, and there are. I mean, the really interesting thing is there is something to be said for one's physical and mental health for being part of a church, and I'm using church broadly for, you know, a religious gathering, not just a particular faith, but for religious belief, spiritual belief, and for religious or spiritual practice. Like all 3 have effect. And it turns out that the real life effect is from all 3. So there is some value simply like willingly showing up whatever number of times is now regular. I think then it was more than 3. But showing up reasonably regularly to church tends to attract or create people who live healthier lives. Like that's a reasonably robust finding that people tend to take better care of themselves, they tend to have better habits, and they get something from the social support. The interesting piece, and then the caveat to that, is people who attend church service do on average live longer than people who don't. Then there's that joke, well, they may not live longer, it just may seem like it. You know, that's the that's the same thing with married people. You know, the research shows they live longer. The counter is, yeah, but they may not, but it sure seems like it. But so religious attendance makes facilitates or is aligned with longer life. There are two things about that. One is you can make some of the difference up by volunteering to help other people. So there's a factor inside of we humans where we need to have something positive, pro-social in our lives. So when this research was done, going to church weekly or almost weekly was affiliated with longer life. But one of the ways that people can have similar impact is to do volunteer work for people not in their close personal proximity. So it doesn't mean you have to travel to Venezuela. It means that taking your kid to soccer practice is not volunteer work. Putting dinner on the table for your family is, it's helping people who are outside of your sphere. But the really interesting piece is when they factor in all of the tangible things that church might offer, like community, social support, ethics, fellowship. It never accounts for all of the variance. That there is likely a little bit of an X factor of faith, grace, who knows? But that there is something about church, regular church attendance that is helpful. There is something helpful about religious belief, positive belief, not negative belief. So people who believe that God is punishing and that you're going to go to hell, or that you're being punished for what you did if you're sick or if you have bad things happen to you, that does not translate into health benefits. People who have a belief in a benevolent God or a supportive church community or some kind of positive underpinning, they tend to recover better from operations. They tend to have fewer side effects from things. They tend to have positive outcomes from medical experiences. Some of that, again, is simply that they have a community that cares about them. One of the most fascinating studies was they simply looked at men over 65 who had had a heart attack. And the only research was on tracking how many people came to visit them. If nobody came to visit them, which is horrifying, they had about a 30+% mortality rate. If one person came to visit them, the mortality rate, separate from any physical condition, was about 22, 23%. And if two or more people came to visit them, the mortality rate down went to about 16%. The physical illness didn't change at all, not even slightly, but the social support mattered. They did a similar kind of study where they checked out belief in a loving God. and found out that the stronger people's belief was in a loving God, the more likely they were to go through a certain cardiovascular procedure without negative consequences. So there is something about coming together regularly with caring people and a positive belief in something benign or good that is health enhancing. There's an interesting caveat, not caveat to this, but of how hard science is. There's a lot of data that shows that if you look at people's diets, the more they eat meat, they have a tendency to higher rates of illness. So that the confirmed meat eaters have higher rates of illness than like vegetarians, who have somewhat higher rates of illness than vegans. It is a linear progression, but they did a really interesting study, which is they looked at people coming into a Whole Foods in Denver, Colorado. May have done it in more than one, but at least one. And they got to know a good number of people shopping at Whole Foods. And they found that when you looked at that kind of population of people who were affluent, who went out of their way to buy food like that, all of a sudden being a vegetarian didn't have that much health benefit anymore. That it was the lifestyle that went along with the health behaviors that had most of the people going to Whole Foods, they eat all around, they tended to exercise more, they had fewer drug and alcohol problems. So there's a lifestyle that comes along with these things that it's hard to fully tease out. But the piece about religious observance that has most intrigued me is in terms of, I'm going to say ethical behavior, but it's more than ethical behavior. It's, do people who attend church or claim to be, at least in the United States, mostly Christians, do they behave better? You know, if you put a Christian in a room and stick $5 there and not have anybody indicate that there's $5 there, is the Christian more or less likely to take the $5 than the person who doesn't have any church affiliation? They've done these studies. They literally have. They've taken 100 people who say, yeah, I'm a firm believer in Jesus. They stick them in a room with $5 and they pocket the $5. So the data on whether or not religious attendance, religious affiliation makes you a better human being, that data is equivocal. Some shows yes, some shows no. But the place where it has, which was always like what I appreciated, was the researchers distinguished between extrinsic and intrinsic religiosity. Extrinsic is what you do in the world. You know, you show up to church, you attend a Bible study class, you know, you go to social hour. Those have value. But when they're combined with intrinsic religiosity, such as when nobody's watching, you meditate, you have a prayer practice, you read scripture, you talk with other people about how your church or religious attendance is affecting your life for the positive, how you might have resisted temptation. It turns out that when extrinsic religiosity is combined with intrinsic religiosity, the actual practice of the faith, separate from the communal practice, the inner practice, then there's a lot of good stuff that is shown from it, which makes sense to me, because at some level, a church is a limited experience. You know, you come together once, twice a week now, or 3 times out of 8 weeks. You spend 2 hours there. People remind you of positive things. You're reminded of the value of a spiritual life. But that's not the end. I mean, that's not the end purpose. It's what we go home with. And once a week of anything is not sufficient to change or create positive habits. It's just not. So what strikes me as really important for churches is to really emphasize the personal practice of the religion. You know, is to really encourage the intrinsic practice, which doesn't require one to go to church often, but it helps to stay connected to a church because you have a community of practitioners. But the intrinsic practice, so people who have a daily prayer practice, they also show increased well-being and health. People have a daily meditation practice, show that. People who have a daily prayer practice plus read scriptures, like, and again, it's non-denominational, it's reading your scripture. They show increased well-being and increased ethics, which again is a duh if anybody ever thought about it. Like, yeah, you want to get together and you want to remind each other of the basic tenets of the faith, but then you got to practice. You got to go home and do it, and you gotta like put the faith into practice where the rubber hits the road. And so that I think is what is challenging these days in such a harried culture, is to find time for both intrinsic and extrinsic practices. But the point that I wanted to make, and what comforted me 20 years ago when I did a lot of reading on this and really was expert on the data, is that the religious experience is not even close limited to church or religious attendance or the community, but it's that plus the willingness to have some kind of regular internal practice where we try to bring these practices to us to teach us from the inside, not just the outside. Anyway, I thank you all for being the 25% who show up, so I have somebody to talk into my phone at. And I hope you all have a lovely a lovely rest of your day, and I thank you.